is basically about Microsoft AD and Azure AD integration. Agenda for today is this. So we'll talk about Microsoft Active Directory overview. It'll be a brief overview on Active Directory. And Azure AD overview. So we'll see what Azure AD features and capabilities are available for us. We'll talk about Microsoft Azure AD Connect, the tool itself, and what are the options available there. Also, we talk about integrating on-premise Active Directory infrastructure with Azure AD. So, a little bit of history. Active Directory was introduced as a hierarchical authentication and authorization database system, like we all know, to replace the fat file domain system which was used in NT4. Many of us who used NT4 would know how difficult it was with Active Directory in those days. The NT4 domain model in 2000 was working very hard to keep up with the evolving corporate structure and hampered by some limitations. Some things I can recall, for example, where the 26,000 object limit in a flat file architecture, there were only fixed objects. Sorry, was there someone who was speaking? All right, sorry about that. And NT4 domains also primarily use NetBIOS, another flat file Microsoft specific system for its name resolution. For a lot of larger organizations, this necessitated multiple domain databases with limited and complicated interactions between those domains. Active Directory Services was released with Windows Server 2000 and was based on the X.500 network standard. The companies such as Novell, NDS, and Banyan Wines were already using this at that time. This is when Microsoft started introducing this. Microsoft Active Directory domain services are the basic foundation or how our distributed networks were built today. 2003 and 2008 operating systems that use domain controllers are using this hierarchy when carried over from 2000 systems. Active Directory domain services provides secure, structured, and hierarchical data storage for the objects we all know about, like users, computers, printers, and services. While ADDS is a server role in Active Directory today that allows admins to manage and store information about resources from a network, as well as application data. Then we always refer to DNS when we talk about Active Directory. The AD-based system also has this requirement to connect to the internet. Therefore, the DNS system was made a part of Active Directory. So essentially, AD and DNS are two different things. And to support the internet-based era, AD DNS was introduced. The AD-based system also has the, like I mentioned, requirement to connect to the internet. AD also uses DNS as its name resolution system and TCP/IP communication protocols in the use on the internet. It also introduced DHCP, file service, certificate service, and rights management service. ADDS includes AD users, computers, AD Administrative Center, AD Domains and Trust, AD Sites and Services. So these are things which we all know, so I'll not elaborate more on that. So other core services which AD offers is ADCS. So this is basically what we all know as the PKI infrastructure. So one of the things enterprise uses PKI is to configure AD group policies to dictate which users and machines are allowed which types of certificates. The next thing is AD RMS, Rights Management Service, as we all know. it allows us to create policies that enforce and control over the access to information. The idea of RM is unique. Basically, it's unique because it allows us to control granularly control the systems. Then we talked about ADDS already. Moving on to ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services, used in federating the identity of the users and based on this is basically based on the WS Federation standards. So federation authentication allows secure token service, or STS as we all know, in one trust domain to provide authentication information as a STS in another trusted domain when there is a trust relationship between these domains basically. And ADLDS, again, it just uses lightweight, LDAP as its standard, so it's known as lightweight directory services. So moving on, what Active Directory offers us. So for IT admins, we all write scripts and applications that access Active Directory domain services to automate common administrative tasks, such as adding users and groups, managing printers, and setting permissions for the network. For developers, the applications that access the data in Active Directory domain services can be written using Active Directory Services Interfaces API, lightweight Directory Access Protocol API, or the System Directory Services namespace. For end users, we all know it gives us authorization or authentication using a single logon identity when it's domain joined. It also gives us access to various enterprise applications like Exchange, Mailbox, and file servers, printers, etc. So ADDS is still great for managing the authentication and authorization functions for users. So the workstation servers, etc. Within an organization boundary. But it depends on the computers permanently joined to the domain, and protocols such as LDAP for querying, Kerberos for directory authentication, and SMB for downloading group policy data basically, are not suitable for the modern mobile and global workforce, which are the ask for the day. Azure AD, on the other hand, is a version of directory services. It's basically the IDaaS component in the cloud on Azure. Does have quite different capabilities and features compared to ADDS. Its main function now is to manage users, devices that used particularly for roaming users, like users on the internet, not within the corporate network. Today, I think it's helping bridge the gap between the corporate network or the remote users, or let's say the roaming users. Obviously, it is the authentication and authorization mechanism for not only Azure, Office 365 and Intune, but it's capable of integrating with many other third-party applications as well. So with that in mind, let's see what Azure Active Directory offers, or rather an overview of Azure Active Directory. So what exactly is Azure Active Directory? It is how it differs from the Active Directory domains, and is it just another copy of Active Directory in the cloud? While they both have similar functionality, also similar names, I would say, they also have quite different usage capabilities. Microsoft Windows Server, Microsoft Windows Azure Active Directory is a cloud service that provides administrators with the ability to manage end user identities and access privileges, like we talked about earlier, the IDaaS component of it. Azure AD is a cloud-based directory and identity management service. All Microsoft Online business services rely on Azure AD. Like most of you would have used Office 365 when you access your HCL emails. So it is the subscription which gives you access to it. So that subscription already has the free version of it, even if you don't purchase additional license for using your AAD. So administrators, while deploying, can choose which information will stay in the cloud, who can manage it, use the information, and what services or applications can access the information which end users can have access. Azure Active Directory Premium, that's a premium or a paid offering of Windows Azure, provides additional features including user self-service password reset, Group-based application access, additional security reports, and corporate branding options. This is specifically for the administrators. So just a picture of how AD and Azure AD are different. I wouldn't say different, how it actually pans out. Active Directory, again, like we saw earlier, is not an identity solution, but Azure AD is. Active Directory is designed to operate in the corporate networks where enterprise has full control over the topology. The topology exposes services to manage, identity servers, workstation, security, network policies, and so on. And these are exposed through enterprise protocols like LDAP, Kerberos, DNS, AD replication, and so on. Basically, these are the the components which most of the enterprise applications are built on today, which we need to keep in mind. On the other hand, Azure AD is primarily an identity solution designed for internet-based users, applications using HTTP and HTTPS communications. So, like, if you compare it with today's ADDS, it's gone back to a flat file structure from where it evolved in NT4, if you recall what I said earlier. There is no OU structure. Basically, it does not use group policy or group policy objects, which may not be a requirement when you go to cloud. It can be queried with LDAP. I mean, it cannot be queried with LDAP rather. Instead, it uses REST API over HTTP or HTTPS. REST API is now actually migrated to Graph API, so that it's more, robust in terms of providing you reporting and other stuff. It doesn't use Kerberos for authentication. So these are few differences which could see versus AD versus Azure AD here. So these are the features basically which are offered by Azure Active Directory. So you can purchase Microsoft Azure Active Directory Basic or anything for that case, any license online through Microsoft Enterprise Agreement. Also, you can purchase if the company has an agreement with Microsoft, they can purchase it from there, or you can just go to the portal and then purchase it. So the features which it offers here, you can see it offers. There's no limit on the number of objects which can be created unless you are using the free version of it. There's single sign-on. There's self-service password change for cloud users. So this becomes self-service password reset when you go to the premium version, which we'll talk about in a while. There is AD Connect. Join a device to Azure AD desktop using SSO. And then there is group-based access management and provisioning, SSPR, like I mentioned earlier. There's also an option of putting your company's logo. I'll talk about this in a while, why it's important for somebody who's going to cloud or somebody who's going to leverage the Azure infrastructure to brand their tenant in a while. So if you are using at least the basic version, you will be able to put your company logo or brand it at this point. So it also gives you application proxy, self-service group and app management. Then moving on, multi-factor authentication. So on-premise and cloud, we'll see how this can be achieved as well. So there is MIM, Cloud Apps Discovery. So Azure AD Connect Health. This is basically a feature which you would see it on the portal where if your the synchronization is healthy or not. So that's one feature which you get if you go to P1 and P2. So automatic password rollover for account groups. And then there is enterprise state roaming. So the enterprise state roaming is basically a feature when your machine is joined to Azure AD. People or the users will be able to leverage all the things available in the cloud or use the SSO features and etc. etc. So there's identity protection, privileged identity management, So these are the features which are actually available in Azure AD. So we'll look at some of the features in more detail. So one of them is single sign-on. So when we talk about single sign-on, there are two options: federation-based single sign-on. So users are automatically signed into the application using their credentials from Microsoft Azure AD. So Azure AD Directory connects lets basically you to configure federation with on-premise Active Directory. So you basically set up a federation between your on-premise and your cloud. With federation sign-in, you can enable users to sign in to Azure AD based services with their on-premise password while on the corporate network without having to enter their passwords again. So by using this federation option with ADFS, you can deploy a new installation of ADFS, or you can specify an existing installation in Windows Server. So if you're already using an ADFS server, you can specify that. And then there is password-based single sign-on. So this is basically workout for companies who do not want to deploy additional infrastructure of ADFS servers. So users are automatically signed into applications again using their credentials from third-party applications. The single sign-on Azure AD seamless SSO feature of Azure AD adds extra value. Basically, it gives you the same experience like a federation sign-on to the Azure AD authentication process, and provides a better experience for your users by eliminating the need to enter passwords again and again. For on-premise users that need to authenticate with Azure AD to access resource, typically an organization will enable password hash synchronization. Again, Azure AD Connect would be involved here, or Passthrough Authentication. This allows on-premise users to use the same credentials they use on-premise for access to the cloud resources, which all we know. And then there is business to business collaboration and business to client collaboration here. Azure AD business to business, or both Azure Active Directory B2B and B2C allow you to work with external users in Azure AD. Basically, B2B is for business that want to securely share files and resources. You can think about a scenario where in the earlier days, when you want to share some information with another forest or another company, we used to do federation between two companies. So it's a similar situation here. And Azure admin sets up a B2B in the Azure, so it's basically clicks. And Azure AD takes care of the federation between your business and your external partner. Users sign into the shared resource using simple, so there will be an invitation sent out and redemption process with their work or any email account which has been set up. So B2C is primarily for business and developers. So with the developers can use the Azure AD identity system for their application while letting customers sign in with their identity. So they can use either Gmail or Facebook to gain access. So these are some of the features which we looked at earlier. So self-service password resets. Like most of the CIOs would read it, the cost of a password reset to an organization is not only a waste of time, it actually is very solvable at this point using your Azure AD. In addition, you have the time taken for IT to respond to such requests. It's actually a loss of revenue. So basically to enable this feature, they need to have the license assigned to specific user accounts. Only then they will be able to leverage the self-service password reset options. So identity protection is another feature. Azure Active Directory identity protection of the Azure AD Premium P2 edition that enables you to detect potential vulnerabilities affecting your organization identities. You configure automated response to detected suspicious actions that are related to your organization identities. Investigate suspicious incidents and take appropriate action to resolve them. So it's basically interface where you can see if if there is any suspicious activities. So this means that all the sign-in attempts are carefully monitored, whereby you can set the alerts or even block access to accounts upon series of failures or suspicious behavior. For example, if you can set an account can be accessed from a specific region. So if a user is using VPN to sign in from a specific place, you can allow that the traffic only from that specific subnet. So if the user tries to log in from another subnet, it will actually block the account. So those kind of things can be done. So moving on to the branded tenancy. So like I spoke about earlier, so while most companies don't do this, in reality, if you don't do this, it's another easy way for a hacker to actually, or one step less for a hacker to spoof your URL and gain access to the credentials of a user. It's basically a simple task to implement. You just import the logo with specific the size of the BMP picture or PNG picture, and that's it. That will take care of it. So moving on, Azure AD Join. So this is another feature. I already gave a brief about this. The goal of this is basically to simplify Windows deployment of work on devices. So if there are companies who are startups who don't want to manage their Active Directory environment, this would be a boon for them basically. So they will only have to do is to allow in their portal to join the machines to Azure AD. So access to the organizational app and resources from any Windows device. I'm really not sure if this would come to your Windows handheld mobile devices. I'm talking about the cellular phones, which Microsoft is working on. But at this point, any Windows device which is Windows 10 would allow you to leverage this feature. So cloud-based management of work on devices. Azure AD Join makes it possible, like I mentioned, for work on Windows devices to your company Azure Active Directory. User can sign into Windows with their cloud-hosted work credentials and actually access all the apps which they have authorization for. And the compliance is also met using the Azure AD. It also does SSO, so you don't have to log into multiple apps. So once you're logged into your laptop or any Windows device for that case, you gain access to everything which is SSO enabled. And this also supports hybrid environment. When I say hybrid environment, some companies who wants to leverage the best of both worlds, like how they say, of using on-premise users authenticating to the on-premise AD, and some users who are remotely working and they don't want to extend their infrastructure or AD to the remote location, they can enable this for those users. So that's how the hybrid environment that would work out for them. So moving on to the next one. So multi-factor authentication. So this is becoming more and more important when in the cloud era now. The security of two-step verification basically lies in multiple authentication factors. This presents a significant challenge for the attackers, we could say. So if the simple modus operandi of an attacker would be to just gain access to the password. So typically we all know, so they just give you a spoofed URL and then you enter your username and password. So they have the password with them. So with this multi-factor authentication, even if an attacker manages to learn the user's password, it is useless without also having the possession of additional authentication methods. So it basically works by requiring two or more of the authentication methods. So basically requiring you to know something, typically a password, which probably the hacker got his hands on. And also you should have a trusted device. So this typically is like a OTP which is sent to your mobile device. You would have experienced this when you are doing your internet banking. You receive an OTP every time you need to do a transaction. So similar to that, you either have a OTP sent to your phone. You can also set up app, Microsoft app called Authenticator, which actually changes the code every 1 minute, so which is produced as a challenge after you put the password, thus making it difficult for anybody else to gain access. And you can also use the biometric. So if you have used your phone, you can use your fingerprint to gain access to your apps. So most of you would have experienced this while using OA, I feel. So just give you a hint. Moving on. There is conditional access based on your sign-in characteristics. So just a brief here, security again is a top concern for organizations. Users can access organization resources using a variety of devices. Like we all know, we carry Android phones, we carry iPhones, we carry Windows laptops. Just focusing on who can access the resources is not sufficient. We all have access to the resources. To balance between the security and productivity, you also need the factor how a resource is accessed. With Azure AD Conditional Access, you can address this requirement. Excuse me. So it's basically a set of policies and configuration that controls the device which have access to various services and data. In Microsoft environment, conditional access works with Office 365 suite of products as well as with SaaS apps, which are configured in Azure Active Directory. So we spoke about the aspect of it. So why do we need conditional access? Like the cloud-centric world, it becomes difficult to control access to the documents and data to run the business. While we always kept the content behind the corporate firewall earlier, now we can't do that. So, like I told earlier, all of them have their own devices. Not a lot of devices are company-owned. So that's when the conditional access comes into picture. So conditional access, how it works, it basically relies on a signal from either the corporate AD domain or Microsoft Intune. Intune is a separate product. To check if the compliance of the device prior to or rather gaining access to the data. So before this, the mobile devices must be enrolled in Intune, which provides security policies, settings, and verifies that the device is not rooted or jailbroken. So Windows PCs are required to be joined to the enterprise AD domains where the policies are enforced. If the user's device is not compliant, this policy or the conditional access will guide the users once the policy is implemented, guide the users on how to get the device into compliance or register the device to the company's corporate network or Azure AD. So following are some of the common access concerns with conditional access. So sign-in risk, again, we spoke about this. The network location, like I had explained, users can sign in from their home, they can sign in from an internet cafe or from the office. So device management, again, we talked about the different types of devices which all of us can gain access to company data. Again, this can be controlled with your client application also. Just to give you an example, it's not directly related to conditional access. So if you have configured your Outlook on your phone, you would have seen that you would need to provide a PIN or basically you provide your fingerprints if you have fingerprint enabled phones. So that is something which is managed by Intune, just to give you an idea. All right, moving on. Privileged identity management. So privileged identity management is a capability focused on special requirements of managing highly privileged access. So we all know, so earlier, if an Exchange admin needed access to Exchange resources, he needed to be a domain administrator. Then the role-based access control came into picture, and the domain admins where domain admin access was not required for an Exchange admin to perform his day-to-day activities. So he just needed to be an Exchange administrator. He could be organization administrator or anybody else. So similar to that, the privilege access management is a security and governance tool to help companies meet compliance regulations and prevent system and data breaches. So basically, an elevated account, if it's hacked, it is a threat. So it gives access to everything the company has, or rather the company's data. So how this works is basically PIM ensures that you can issue a workflow, provide temporary admin. You can limit the possibility of credentials getting hacked to requiring MFA additional to the PIM or manager approval. In addition, to identify the source of a breached event, PIM enables you also to locate the specific accounts used in an attack. So what happens if a specific account is compromised? PIM actually records this, and then it will locate that specific account, like we talked about earlier. So that becomes even more relevant. So like today there is a research which says it takes about 4 months to acknowledge an average security breach. So this is what PIM actually is about. So moving on. There is My Apps portal. It's a very useful portal, I would say. So this hub enables quick access to a vast amount of organization and Azure approved applications. By using the My Apps portal, you can edit some of your profile settings, change the password associated with your work account, edit password reset settings. So if you have security questions set, or if you have other two-factor credential set, you can change that. You can edit the contact preferences settings related to multi-factor authentication, like I mentioned. View account details such as user ID, alternate email ID, mobile, and those kind of stuff. And also start cloud-based applications that Azure AD administrator granted access to you. So again, if you have access to self-managed group, administrator can create managed security groups and request security group membership in Azure AD. So we'll move on. So what Azure AD offers you? So for IT admins, Azure AD provides a more secure solution for your organization through the use of stronger identity management and single sign-on, access to thousands of apps. Through these apps, you'll also get cloud-based app security, seamless access, enhanced collaboration, and automation of identity lifecycle. For your employees, helping to increase both security and compliance. So for app developers, so they help building the apps. It lets them integrate with the identity management solution that's used by millions of organizations around the world. So for Office 365, Azure and CRM customers, so if you are using Azure AD, each Office 365 Azure and Dynamics CRM on is actually on Azure AD tenant. So it's basically allowing you to access it immediately. So these are some things which the customers who are using Azure AD are doing today. So it gives access to, again, what we talked about, gives you 1,000+ apps using one identity. It protects apps, users, and devices. It also integrates your on-premise and the cloud. We'll talk about how the integration works in a bit. So that the scaling is the important piece here. So Azure AD can complement on-premise Active Directory. So part of where we talk about the integration. For organizations that wish to use AD holistically, they will need to keep their on-premise version of AD. So most organizations do this today, larger organizations, I mean. Azure AD can provide authentication and authorization support for Windows desktop and server instances in Azure. So if you create Windows server instances in Azure, it can provide you authorization. It can manage user logins for Windows 10 devices. We talked about this a while ago with the group policy also. Organization can leverage most of the on-premise features by setting up a hybrid Active Directory. Azure portal will allow you to view the synchronized object, basically. So what are our available options when we use Azure AD for authentication? So Azure AD supports the following authentication types. So cloud-based, where users are managed wholly from Azure AD and their devices and applications can be managed via Intune or Office 365. So it basically is like a cloud-only version of that, and the authentication happens on cloud. So you basically use the portal.office.com and then log in and access everything. And then there is directory synchronization. This is essentially a one-way synchronization from the on-premise ADDS up to Azure AD. So this is using AD Connect, and there is also an option two-way synchronization of very limited number of Azure AD properties, primarily your password sync. And if you implement Azure AD Join, the machine data can also be synced, provided there is license. It's also possible, and two-way synchronization of Exchange attributes is also possible in a hybrid Exchange environment. There is also SSO with ADFS, single sign-on with AD federated services. This means that the user is authenticating against the ADFS instead of Azure AD. So ADFS authenticates the user against your on-premise ADDS, then uses the claim-based delegated token to provide access to resources governed by Azure AD. Without requiring a local account in Azure, and this is completely transparent to the end users. This can be extended to cover other third-party federation identity partners like Google, as well as the ability to add your own identity provider if it's necessary. So there are two solutions for implementing Azure Directory and Identity Services in Azure. Use Azure AD to create Active Directory domain in cloud and connect it to your on-premise Active Directory domain. So this is using your Azure AD Connect. So Azure AD Connect integrates your on-premise directories with Azure AD. There is another option basically to extend your existing on-premise Active Directory infrastructure to Azure by deploying a VM in Azure that runs ADDS as domain controller. So this would be requiring a lot of architecture changes. So this architecture is more common, like when you want the on-premise network and Azure Virtual Network are connected by VPN or Express Route. Several variations of this architecture are possible. I've listed three. So create a domain in Azure and join it to your on-premise AD forest. Create a separate forest in Azure. This is like a resource forest scenario that is trusted by domains in your on-premise forest, or replicate the Active Directory Federation Services deployment into Azure. So basically you are creating a copy of your on-premise infrastructure or on-premise architecture rather to Azure. So with that in mind, let's see how the things we talked about, the integration could be possible. So let's talk about Azure AD Connect now. So understanding directory synchronization, the AD Connect tool is what does the synchronization. It is used to synchronize objects in AD to Azure AD. Is based on the Microsoft Identity Management and its predecessors specifically, and uses an approach referred to as meta directory to maintain and synchronize your object. So just to give you a background on Microsoft Identity Management, this is available on-premise in Windows Server 2016, probably should be available in 2019 also. Microsoft also used a product called Forefront Identity Manager and Identity Lifecycle Manager before Forefront Identity Manager, and before that it was Microsoft Identity Integration Services, I think. Yeah, so that's what it was. So by definition, a meta directory is simply a collection of directories. So it's basically you can integrate multiple on-premise Active Directory ADDS infrastructure rather. So the ultimate goal of meta directory is to maintain a connection between each object and as well as any new objects which are created. So any changes in the Active Directory, or rather any changes in the directory, can be updated to all the connected objects. So when synchronizing the data to Azure, however, there are several objects such as foreign security principles and trusted platform modules, also known as TPMs, with the devices which you would not want to sync to your tenant. So the AD Connect tool actually enables you, by using scoping filters, you can actually filter this out. So the Azure AD Connect server must have, you cannot install a AD Connect on a server core, so that's what I wanted to convey. Azure AD Connect must be installed. The minimum requirement for installing Azure AD Connect is Windows Server 2008 or later. So while it may not be recommended or a best practice in a larger organization, you can actually install AD Connect on a domain controller if it's a smaller organization running a single domain controller. There is one other thing. There is for the feature called password synchronization with Azure AD Connect, the server must be on Windows Server 2008 SP1. And if you want to use the group managed service account in Azure AD Connect, that feature, this can only be done if you have if you have installed AD Connect in Windows Server 2012 or later. If you would need Active Directory Federation services to be deployed, the server where ADFS or Web Application Proxy are installed must be on Windows 2012 R2 or later. So these are few caveats before we actually proceed. For deploying again the Active Directory Federation services, you will also need the SSL certificates. So with that said, what are the authentication options available? So there is Synchronized Identity, there is Federated Identity, and there is Passthrough Authentication, and there is Cloud-Only Identity. So which is self-explanatory basically. Cloud-Only Identity is everything on cloud. So let's talk about Synchronized Identity. So the key component here, which we spoke about elaborately, is your Azure Active Directory Connect. Originally, it was known as DIRSync and then as AAD Sync. This is a small download, basically with a wizard driven installation to help you configure it quickly and easily. Like I said, it requires Windows Server 2008 or higher, and it's not supported on a small business server or a Windows Server Essential. Well, it's normally not the best practice in larger organizations, like I mentioned. If you have a smaller organization or if you are doing a lab or anything like that, you could install it on a domain controller. So, and there is this password hash synchronization. The password hash synchronization is a feature used to synchronize your user password from on-premise Active Directory instance to cloud-based Azure AD instance. So you could use this feature to sign into Azure AD services. You sign in to the service by using the same password you use to sign into your on-premise Active Directory instance. The Active Directory domain services stores the password in the form of password hash. So every account has a password hash. So the password hash is stored in the Azure Active Directories. With that, not giving any concern on the password being replicated or stored somewhere else. To synchronize your password, Azure AD Connect syncs, extracts your password hash from the on-premise Active Directory instance, like I mentioned. So extra security processing is applied to the password hash before it's synchronized to Azure Active Directory Authentication service. And there is this Passthrough Authentication. This gives you a similar experience of federated login. So Passthrough Authentication doesn't require the synchronization of hashed password details into Azure Active Directory. Instead, user authentication authenticates against the cloud service, is redirected back to AD Connect and your on-premise domain controllers. So you need to have a running and responding domain controller in this case. So in the other case, even if your domain controller did not respond, since the passwords are synced, the users could authenticate. So this also means that the network reliability and congestion can also have an impact on the user experience. So you really need to plan for a high available infrastructure, so which is most of the enterprises have high available and reliable infrastructure deployed. But it's recommended in a way to have a high available infrastructure. It also has a minimum requirement of Windows Server 2012 to R2, like I mentioned earlier. And second, for running another instance of Passthrough Authentication agent to help with high availability. The reason why some would go down this path is that they may have additional restrictions that require the users to be authenticated against or an on-prem domain controller rather than against Azure Active Directory. You can the domain provided by Azure AD Domain Services again is a managed domain. You don't need to provision. So let's move on from there. And then there is hybrid authentication with federation via ADFS. So this is the final option basically of the 4 we discussed. The final option, Active Directory Federation service is deployed. The solution requires more infrastructure, so basically you would need at least a couple of ADFS servers, couple of proxy servers deployed in your DMZ for this to be facilitated. Federated authentication solution is usually required when a customer has an authentication requirement that Azure AD does not support natively. So authentication that requires smart card. Some of the examples here: authentication by using third-party authentication solutions. Federation compatibility list requires SAM account name. For example, if you are not using UPN, so then this would be the solution. Also domain name / username if you want people to use your domain / username for authentication. So this would be one solution you should be considering. So moving on, let's see how we can integrate on-prem AD with Azure AD. So that was basically about Azure AD Connect. Now we'll move on with the on-premise to Azure AD integration. So talking about this, so the domain provided by Azure AD Domain Services is a managed domain, like I mentioned earlier. You don't need to provision or configure or otherwise manage domain controllers for this domain. These management activities are provided as is as a service. So you cannot manage the domain controller if you have created a Azure AD tenant. Azure AD Domain Services does not currently provide a geo-redundant deployment model. It's limited to a single virtual network, basically. So if you have a requirement to deploy it in multiple geos, this is not an option. So this is when you want to consider these options, which we are going to discuss. So deploy the domain services server to Azure, create a domain in Azure, and join it to your on-premise AD forest. Like I said, consider this option if you need to use ADDS features that are not currently implemented by Azure AD. The benefits which it provides is access to the same identity information that is available on-premise. You can authenticate users, services, and computer accounts on-premise, and in Azure, you don't need to manage a separate AD forest. The domain in Azure can belong to the on-premise forest. So you can apply group policy defined by on-premise group policy objects to the domain in Azure. The challenges here, you must deploy and manage your own ADDS servers, which some of them might not prefer when they go to cloud. Why would they want to manage the devices? There may be some synchronization latency between the domain servers in the cloud and the servers running on-premise. This is typically negated by deploying an express route connection or a point-to-point connection between Microsoft data center and your data center. This is something which needs to be considered when this kind of implementation or deployment is done. So this is typical reference architecture. This architecture shows you how to extend the Active Directory environment to Azure. It provides distributed authentication service using Active Directory domain services. Is used to the architecture here shows ADDS is used to authenticate users, computer application, and other entities that are included in the security domain. So it can be hosted on-premise, but if your application is hosted partly on-premise and partly in Azure, it may be more efficient to replicate this functionality in Azure. This can reduce the latency caused by sending authentication and local authorization request from the cloud back to ADDS running on-premise. This architecture also supports bidirectional replication, which is not possible when you do it with AD Connect. If you remember when I said there are only specific features which can be replicated back to your on-premise using AD Connect. Typical uses of this architecture include hybrid applications in which functionality is distributed between on-premise and Azure, applications and services that perform authentication using Active Directory. So create an Active Directory domain services ADS resource for Azure. I discussed about this earlier. So deploy AD domain services server Azure. Create a Active Directory forest. on-premise orders basically. The forest is trusted by domains, like how you would do for a company which is acquired newly, or if you want to collaborate with another company. So you basically create a trust by the domains on your on-premise forest and your Azure AD. So create an Active Directory Domain Services ADDS resource forest in Azure. I discussed about this briefly earlier. So deploy AD Domain Services server to Azure, but create a separate Active Directory forest from the on-premise forest. Basically, the forest is trusted by domains, like how you would do for a company which is acquired newly, or if you want to collaborate with another company. So you basically create a trust by the domains on your on-premise forest and your Azure AD. Typical uses of this architecture include maintaining security separations. A lot of the financial services company do this to ensure there is a boundary created between specific applications or specific resources which they would want access to only for a set of people, or a set of team rather. Security separation for objects and identities held in the cloud, and migrating individual domains from on-premises to cloud. So if you want to migrate specific individual domains from on-premises to cloud, this can be done as well. So benefits of this: you can implement on-premise identities and separate Azure-only identities. You don't need to replicate from on-premise AD forest to Azure. So the challenges we face here is authentication with Azure for on-premise identities request extra network hops on-premise. You must deploy your own ADDS servers and forest in the cloud and establish appropriate trust. So this is basically two teams who would be working, or two sets of resources which your administrator needs to support. So that's another thing we need to keep in mind. So the reference architecture for this, you can see the Active Directory Domain Services stores the identity information, like you all know, in a hierarchical structure. The top node in the hierarchical structure is known as the forest. A forest contains domains, and domains contain other type of objects. So this reference architecture creates ADDS forest in Azure with a one-way outgoing trust and with the on-premise domain. The forest in Azure contains a domain trust that does not exist on-premise. Because of the trust relationship, logons are made. On-premise domains can be trusted for access to resources in the separate Azure domain. So typical uses of this architecture, including maintaining security separations, like I mentioned, and held in the cloud, and migrating individual domains from on-premise to cloud. So you could also extend ADFS to Azure. So when I say extend ADFS to Azure, you basically replicate everything on-premise into the Azure cloud. So replicate an Active Directory Federation service deployment to Azure to perform federated authentication. So this could also work out like a DR scenario where you have ADFS deployed in Azure as well as on-premise. So users who are authenticating against the cloud will be directed to the cloud ADFS, and the ones on-premise would be directed to on-premise. So this would also need a lot of DNS changes to be performed to perform a federated authentication and authorization for components running in Azure. So typical uses of this architecture rather, so authenticate and authorize users from partner organizations. Say if you want to do that, allow users to authenticate from web browsers running outside of your organizational firewall. Allow users to connect from authorized external devices such as mobile devices. So you can leverage the claims-aware applications, provide the ability to trust external partners. For authentication, compatibility with a large set of authentication protocols. So these are some of the benefits which you gain by doing this. You must also deploy your own ADDS, ADFS web application proxy servers in Azure. So that's an additional overhead cost as well as administration overhead to think of. With that, we talk about the reference architecture. So this looks a very complex architecture to replicate here. The diagram shows the following scenarios. So application code from a partner organization accesses a web application hosted inside your Azure VNet. An external registered user with credentials stored inside Active Directory domain services accesses a web application hosted inside your Azure VNet. User connected to your VNet using an authorized device executes a web application hosted inside your Azure VNet. So typical uses for this architecture, hybrid applications where workloads run partly on-premise and partly in Azure. And solutions that use federated authorization to expose web applications to partner organizations. Systems that support access from web browsers running outside of the organization firewall. A system that enable users to access to web applications by connecting from authorized external devices such as remote computers, notebooks, and other mobile devices. So these are the typical use cases for these. And with that, I complete my presentation.